Kylan Hunter as our speaker tonight. Kylan Hunter is currently a C Center for International Security and Diplomacy Research Fellow and a PhD student at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Her research on the impact on socio-political culture of women in the military as well as politically violent actors. She focuses specifically on how and why states recruit women into combat roles, and its impact on social culture and public policy. Her work has been accepted for presentation at multiple domestic and international academic conferences and journals. She is also a contributor for Gender and Foreign Affairs to the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Al Jazeera, NPR, Fox News, and the Huffington Post. Guest posts for Political Violence at a Glance, Duck of Minerva, and Foreign Policy, and frequently contributes to local media. In addition to her own research, she has been involved in the Program on Terrorism and Insurgency Research, the Program on Nonviolent and Violent Campaigns and Outcomes, and manages the Carnegie Corporation of New York's Program on Nonviolent Action and Violent Conflicts. She's taught master's level classes in international politics and diplomacy and serves on the board of Mountain to Mountain and has accompanied both founder and film crew to Afghanistan to assist with the women's Afghan national cycling team. Kylan has spent over a decade as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. She flew the AH-1W Super Cobra attack helicopter with multiple tours in support of operations enduring freedom and Iraqi freedom. She was the first female Cobra pilot in her squadron. Her non-flying tours include 3 years in the House of Representatives, serving as both a congressional fellow and a congressional liaison officer. During this tour, she planned and escorted congressional delegations to 52 countries, frequently dual-hatting as both an escort and a military liaison. Please join me in welcoming Kylan Hunter.
All right, well, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon, whatever time it is, taking time away from this beautiful day to come talk about gender and recruitment into armed groups. So the focus really today is that, there's me, back in the day, there's like a young me, so you can see the difference now. It's not that I'm like super accomplished, I'm just older. back in the day when I was young and brave and crazy. So, really today, there's a few reasons why I want to give this talk. One is to kind of flip the script. A lot of times we talk about women in conflict zones or women in war zones. We talk about women as the victims or women who experience violence to them. And we rarely give a lot of consideration to the women who choose to be violent actors in this group. And whether it's in terrorist organizations, in rebel groups, in insurgencies, or even in state-sanctioned militaries. And frequently these women sort of get brushed aside or forgotten about or not really given a lot of consideration. And for those of you who were there earlier today, this does have an impact on post-conflict societies. When we don't give real solid agency to these women who choose to participate violently, they're frequently forgotten in the post-conflict societies. And today, both in the formal military world and also in the informal world of rebel groups and terrorist organizations, you're seeing women participate in these organizations in an ever-increasing number. I mean, the rate of growth is huge. And so that's why, really right now, I think it's important that we start talking about this and that we start asking some of these hard questions as to why women are both drawn to these groups and choose to participate in them, and then also why they're recruited into these groups and why both formal and informal leadership sees a value added to bringing into them. So real quick, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of the background and historical examples of how we have historically classified women who choose to participate in these violent movements. And so this is just going to kind of give us a framework to talk more about the current issues and also address some of the reasons why women are frequently forgotten and left out of this dialogue. For current issues, I'm going to talk about both rebel groups, why you're seeing women participate in greater and greater numbers, and also why they're being recruited in more and more, and then also the military and some of the unique challenges that are being posed to a lot of new military policies and the national agendas of bringing women into the militaries. So when we talk about women in violence, what we really need to look at is that violence not only has a functional role, but it has a social role in society. That the functional role of violence, and when we're talking about violence here, for shorthand, I do mean political violence. I'm not talking about interpersonal violence, but violence that is meant to achieve a political purpose, whether that's for a state or for a group that's trying to counter the state. So functionally, it's there to win wars. But more importantly, it has a social purpose. And the history of many cultures are intertwined with violence. They are intertwined with the stories of war heroes. They are intertwined with the way that nations were born out of very tumultuous past. So every culture around the world has some form of political violence as its origin story, whether it's the Revolutionary War, or it's the Greek gods warring to create and fighting over mankind. There's this idea of violence. And wrapped up in that idea has always been the reproduction of gender roles. You have the historic warrior, and then you have the maiden, for lack of a better way of putting it. You have the woman who's being protected, the woman who is tending the hearth while the brave soldier goes out and conquers the land. And so throughout history, the institution of political violence, when we think about militaries, when we think about rebel groups, has really been a place where these gender roles are reproduced. That you have the male soldier held up as a citizen ideal. You have the male rebel as the one who's willing to stand up to the government, while you have the woman who stays at home and tends to the hearth. And even when we talk about a lot of these extra roles that women take on during conflict, they all tend to stay in line with this narrative, to reproduce this idea that women are doing things on the home front to free a man to fight, for lack of a better term. So a lot of the motivation questions that I bring to this, and this comes from both my own experience as being a woman who chose to participate in a very non-traditional and violent role, and I was the second woman ever to hold this position, flying the Cobra. For those of you who are unfamiliar with military technology, the Cobra is the attack helicopter, and it serves no purpose other than to shoot things or shoot missiles. Like it's not a transport aircraft, it's not a personnel carrier, it's got one role. And for a very long time, it was a role that was closed to women. And it was actually even when a lot of jet aircraft were opened up, the Cobra community stayed closed for quite a while. So myself and one other woman were the first two to go through. She was West Coast, I was East Coast. So a lot of my academic questions actually come from some of the things that I experienced myself, and then that I saw during my deployments and subsequent work over in Afghanistan, and where I see a big gap in the way that women who choose these violent roles are really treated and really approached, and have been very long been dismissed, essentially. So when I think about what motivated myself to come to ask these questions, and what I think that the larger policy world should also be motivated by, is first is how have women been portrayed as agents of violence throughout history. And I'm briefly going to go into kind of three primary caricatures that we've had of violent women, and how that still shapes our policy actions and our social roles that we are playing in. And then the next is really how are these either challenging or reinforcing gender norms? And when is it okay for some of these gender norms to be challenged, and when do we kind of feel as a society and as a culture that it's okay to challenge these norms, and when have we really put a foot down hard and said, no, we can't really cross that line? And then finally, how, and more importantly, why, are we now wanting women in these roles? And why are governments in the Western world making a huge role to recruit women into militaries? Why are rebel groups, you look at the FARC in Colombia, you look at the Kurds, you look at even ISIS, who are outwardly saying we need women, we're targeting women, we are specifically looking to bring women into our groups. And so that's really the main thing that drives, is that why. And I really think that in order to get to the root of that question, we need to change the way that we're looking at women in these roles. So historically, there are three kind of main tropes when you look at women in violent roles. The first is the warrior culture, very much this myth of the Amazon idea. And you kind of have two main threads of this. You have the Greek side of the myth of the Amazon, which gave this place to defeat barbarians. You know, it's this woman warrior culture who defeated the horrible barbarians, and they served a purpose, and yet they were still separate. You know, they stayed separate from society. And it was very much okay to have this woman warrior culture because they weren't part of the fold. They weren't really one of us. You could really otherize them still. You know, they had their purpose, but you know, they were savages. They weren't women. They were something else, even if they were you know, females. And then you look at the way the Amazon culture in South America has been presented. It was a way to genderize and otherize the enemy. You know, it was a way to almost lessen the enemy. It's to say, like, well, they're Amazons, they're women, so they're not really a worthy adversary, and we'll just sort of leave them alone. And there is, to various degrees, whether or not these cultures really existed, you'll see evidence on either side, but they've created this perpetual myth that there's this place for these violent women, but it's not with us. You know, they have their own culture, they're separate from where we are. And this is also reproduced in the idea of a lot of the gods and goddesses. You know, that you have some goddesses who are warring and who go out and shoot and go out and hunt. However, you know, they stand as this sort of separate, other, degenerated thing. And then finally, when we talk about this idea of the warrior culture, we have the impact of technology and what technology has brought in. In early days, you saw this as the introduction of horses into battle, and that it was okay to have females ride horses to go into battle because they weren't foot soldiers. You've seen this in more modern militaries where, okay, you can have women who can captain ships because they're not foot soldiers, or women who nowadays fly planes. You see it that way because they're not foot soldiers. And technology in this woman warrior culture really puts a barrier between the individual and the act of violence. And in this way, we've been able to more socially accept the role of women in conflicts as long as they do it through a technology. Whether that technology is a horse or it's a plane, we're able to say, okay, you're separate. You know, you're still not a woman engaging directly with the enemy, and that culturally becomes okay with us. The second sort of trope that we have with women in violence is a singular war heroine. You know, this is the Joan of Arcs of the world, that we love to look up to that heroine. We love to embody the spirit of the nation. And in this way, you see a lot of natural cultures talk about their motherland, which very much becomes okay that if you have a woman who can inspire a nation, that's okay. It still has, she's able to be formed in this very maternalistic way, that she's doing it to sacrifice her own family, to care for her own family in order to birth the nation and better the nation. And we see this today, and we see this in our own culture today. We see this with the way that the women who completed Ranger School just recently were treated. That they are, we look at them as these great heroes, we look at them as these great role models, and yet we still as a society become very uncomfortable with the idea of women as on total being in these roles. So having a singular war heroine and praising a singular war heroine is a way that society has allowed individual women to engage in these conflicts without standing in a lot of contrast or in contention to social gender roles. And finally, the one that perpetuates the most and is actually the most harmful is the deviant. And that somehow women who choose to engage in these roles are no longer actually women. They either become men, and a lot of times if you look back through the US Civil War history and back to the Revolutionary War and the French Revolution, women did actually dress as men to go and fight. It wasn't just that they took on these characteristics of like becoming strong and macho and violent or whatever, but they physically disguised themselves as men. This created huge problems when the conflict is over and they try to come back into society, because now nobody wants to accept them because they think that they're a man. The other way that you see this happen is the idea of the demon lover that comes in, that a woman is either so like head over heels in love with some man that she will do anything for him, even go be violent, because it's his cause, and so she just becomes a pawn. for him. And this is a lot of the ways that when you look at women in terrorist movements, that you see them portrayed. That it wasn't her agency. She couldn't help herself. She had to go do something like this. And then the other side you see that is the hypersexualization of women, and that they join basically to control men with their sexual power. That it's not because they have agency or ability to actually be warriors, but they have the ability to sexually manipulate men to do what they want in violent conflicts. And this has been very much institutionalized. Gaddafi's female bodyguard is kind of the caricature of this, but it's a very real caricature. It exists. He had these women, as you can see in the picture here, like follow him around, and that was their role, was to be able to essentially sexually manipulate people that he didn't agree with. And it worked very well, but again, it was this way that we could see, oh, well, I guess there's a place for women in these violent groups if they are these sexually manipulative beings. So those are the three kind of ways that both scholarship and society has treated women in these roles. So with those in our back of our mind, now let's look at what's actually happening and what women are actually doing in these conflicts and some of the reasons that women actually join, and see where the tensions are, and if there's any ways that we should probably be reframing the way that we're looking at this. So when we talk about rebels, and for rebels here, I mean any unofficial politically violent movement that's standing up to a government. So it can be guerrilla groups, it can be an insurgency, it can be organized terrorist groups, but groups that use violence for a political cause that aren't the state, that don't actually have the legitimate sovereign claim on that violence, but it's very explicit that they're being political. So this isn't gangs, this isn't just kind of random thugs groups, this is actually politically motivated groups that want to be a government, want a state. Because I think that's an important distinction to make when we talk about why women are very, very important to be in these roles. So the questions that really motivate us is what motivates women to join? Why do women join? So there's lots of work done on why men rebel, and being a very intelligent crowd, I'm sure most of you have at some point been forced to read some of these why men rebel things. So the question here is, do women rebel for different reasons? Or is it the same? Is it that same sort of grievance idea, either they want something or they feel deprived from something else, or are there other motivating factors that are specific for women saying, no, I need to be violent to have this done? But what this also does is it moves us away from talking about a woman who might be acceptable to do this to actually women. That this is something that is part of womanhood and an acceptable role for women in society to take is to engage with these groups and to join these groups. And so when we're talking about this, it's a chance for us to really expand our viewpoint and not just say, oh, well, she's a hero because she did this, but this is a viable option for women to play in society. Ooh, there we go. So the first thing we can look at with women joining these groups has to do with rebel ideology. And this is really where the biggest differential I see between women joining these rebel movements and these politically violent movements is versus women joining the military. Because frequently, women join these movements as a direct challenge to the state. That this is a way they can stand up and say, the state has been oppressive to us, the state does not give us rights, the state has ignored us as a group, we are going to do something that completely defies what the state says we're allowed to do, and go fight. You saw this in the FMLN in El Salvador. You see this in the FARC in Colombia right now with the women. There's been several interviews that have come out recently in the Washington Post with FARC women, and they'll just have what to say, we're fighting because society says we can't, and so we're going to. You see this with Kurdish women who are standing up to some of the Islamic traditions, which goes to a lot of this religious ideology that, well, your religion says that being killed by a woman's awful, well, I'm a woman and I'll kill you, sort of thing. You saw this in the IRA as a means of challenging traditional British society, that part of their ideology, which goes beyond just this Marxian egalitarianism, which you frequently see as well in the Maoist movements and even a lot of the Latin American guerrilla movements, that it was egalitarian, but more a direct challenge, a way to say, no, we are completely rejecting everything that the state says we should do, so we're doing this, and we're doing it our way, and we're doing it different. And it also provides a way of really this unifying nationalism. As I said at the very beginning of the speech, every culture has their story that's built around war. And this gives women a stake in those new stories. If women fight and women bleed alongside men, they have a claim to their new nation story. And that's something that is a very, very powerful motivator for women to come into these movements. If you read the stories of, there's a great book out about these women in Latin America who say, we want to bleed for our nation because it's part of our story. And then these women can also be co-opted by uniquely women's movements as a result. And this really follows from the idea that women are doing it to challenge the state. And it's this turn of kind of militant feminism, that being violent, defying these norms, having participation in violence as a rite of passage isn't just a man's thing, it's a woman thing as well. And so that's one of the reasons I think that you see women joining a lot of these rebel movements. The next is tactical necessity. And this was also touched on earlier today for those of you that were here, but women, because of their social restrictions that society tends to have around them, really have a unique ability to maneuver around society. And this is when we get into this question of why do leaders see women as unique and women as ones that should be drawn in, is for a lot of these tactical necessities. Women can much more easily move around the civilian population. I think the best sort of visual example of this is if anybody has seen the movie The Battle of Algiers, you see the women in the urban centers walk right in and plant guns. This is really using these essentialist tropes to their advantage. Using the idea that women are never combatants. Women could never do something like this. They're able to use that. They can move within the civilian population. This helps not only for committing actual violence, but gaining intelligence and gathering intelligence and learning things. And this ability to kind of seamlessly transition between civilian and combatant in a very, very unassuming way is something that rebel commanders have really tactically harnessed and you're seeing it more and more. And yes, the Battle of Algiers was quite a while ago, but it's becoming formalized into tactical doctrines. If you go through the FARC's battle plans, there are specific roles that look at this is what women should do. Here's the place that women are more effective because they're more vulnerable, and this government group is more entrenched in the traditional gender roles. So putting a woman in is going to get more information. So you see that. Women also tend to be very, very recruitable, and when we're looking at this sort of grievance idea, in a lot of societies, there's not a lot of economic possibilities for women, especially once conflict breaks out. And if we're looking at rebel groups targeting women and recruiting women, it's a job. It is a way to economically provide for your family. And if you're in a conflict zone where your husband may be targeted for internment because he's a military-age male, well, you go join the rebels and you get paid so you can send your kids to school. So very much, women are a very, very recruitable group. And this is something that when we touch on the military next, we'll also bring up, is that women are a very, very recruitable group into the military for this reason, for the fact that it is a economic opportunity. And in these rebel groups, it's an economic opportunity that frequently transitions into a political opportunity if the rebels choose to win. So it opens doors. It's seen as a means of opening and engaging in society in a way that they never could before, in a very practical manner. And then finally is again, this unexpected nature of women's participation, that it's a surprise. It's something that gives the rebels an upper hand, and not just their women's ability to move kind of fluidly within civilian population, but male combatants on the other side don't expect to get captured by women. They don't expect to get interrogated by women. They don't expect to see women leading combat formations, and it just throws off battle tempo, and it throws off battle rhythm. And when you're engaged in combat, there becomes a certain predictability that comes, that you move, the enemy counter moves, and anything you can do to break that sort of predictability and break the concentration, for lack of a better word, of the enemy, the better. And women provide a unique opportunity, a unique role to do this. And the last thing I'll touch on with rebels is the impact in post-conflict life. So you tend to see one of two things happening. The first, and we'll start with positive, and then go on to the negative, is actually an increased citizenship claims. And Ronald Krebs did a lot of work on this. It's called rhetorical coercion, and it's the ability to use your military service to say, we have rights to be citizens now. If you look at Eritrea, it is a great example of women doing this. Women fighting against Ethiopia. They came from, the women in pre-Civil War society were very non-citizens. And their service in the Eritrean War directly led to their citizenship rights. They were able to say, we fought, we bled, we deserve the exact same thing that our male counterparts deserve. In El Salvador, you see this as well, where women were brought to the negotiating table not because they were women, but because they were very successful within the FMLN. And as a result, they were able to write in political provisions to ensure that women were given expanded rights. And so that that would be the positive side, that it really does open these doors to egalitarian citizenship nature. However, more often what happens is there tends to be a return to this sort of pre-conflict role that women are supposed to have. And there's a few reasons why this happens. One is, again, this framing of women as a deviant, that somehow these women who chose to participate in this conflict aren't actually real women, so they shouldn't belong in society. So they're very much culturally shunned. Men don't want to marry them, their families are very skeptical of them, they're not viewed as being proper. They are looked at as being sexually deviant, they're looked at as being emotionally deviant, they're looked at as being social outcasts. But the second and more important, I think, from a policy side and international community side, is really that there's no institutional recognition for their participation. At the end of conflicts, when you have formal peace processes, there's always some sort of formal disarmament program. And the vast majority of them only address military-age males. And as a result, the women who participated in this are left out. And they're not given the educational opportunities that the men are. They're not given the economic incentives that the men are. And because they weren't women who were victims, they don't get a lot of those incentives either. There's lots of programs that are there for women who were victims of war, whether it's victims of sexual violence of war or who lost family members in war. But there is very, very little recognition to these women who choose to participate for whatever reason it is. And it has marginalized a large group in a lot of these conflicts. And in the question and answer, I'm more than happy to go into a little more detail on this if it's of interest. So next we'll move from these informal politically violent groups to the military, which is a formal political violence institution. So at its heart, the military has, again, two roles. It has its functional role, which is to win wars. It is to do violence on behalf of the state. And it has a societal role, which is to reflect the norms and values of the society it defends and the society it protects. That states want a military that upholds its values. And as much as we want to say the military isn't a social experiment, democracy is a social experiment and the military is a part of that, so the military is. And citizens, especially in democracies, feel much more comfortable being defended by people who are like them, who they believe have their best interests at heart. And so this is when we talk about what the societal imperative of the military is, it does serve this function, especially in democratic regimes, so to clarify again, when I'm talking about the military here, I am broadly referring to militaries in democracies. When we start talking about autocratic regimes, there's a whole lot more mess of people just being forced to do stuff. So we're going on here where people can choose whether or not to be in the military. And so the military has those two roles. And underlying all of this is this citizen soldier idea that exists in democracies. Again, this goes back to this idea that every culture carries the story of its violence as the story of this culture. Every state holds its soldiers as its heroes. So there's this underwritten idea that the soldier has a special place in society and has special citizenship rights within society. So keeping these things in our back of our mind, we're going to look at why would women join, but then also why do states want to recruit women into these jobs more and more. The first thing we're going to talk about is tactical necessity. And this will mirror a lot of what we're talking about rebel groups, why rebel groups want to see women in. States are realizing more and more that women are actually necessary to reach those political objectives. When we talk about the functional imperative of the military, winning wars isn't just killing people. Winning wars is achieving the stated political outcome for that conflict. War isn't more than just pillaging and plundering. Like, we're not Vikings anymore. As much fun as it would be to ride around boats. But so when we think about what the conflict that we're facing today, counterinsurgency is the biggest one. Really, gone are the days of troop on troop war. Infantry's meeting on the battlefield and killing each other, and whoever had the most people standing wins. That's just not the way wars are fought anymore. When I first got into the Marine Corps, we really trained to go fight the Soviets. There were these big tanks that were going to come online, and we were all going to go attack them. That's not going to happen anymore either. The reality is that wars are fought on the micro level. Wars are fought in villages, wars are fought in towns, and wars are won not by killing people, but by hardening people against extremism. And if you look at the empirical evidence from the wars coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, women have been essential to that mission. There's a woman, Ginger Beals, who has a wonderful data set that I found yesterday that is actually goes through all of the different regions, and she breaks it down to the micro team level in Iraq and Afghanistan back to 2001 to now, and looking at ones that have stayed resilient against either Taliban resurgence or have still upheld ISIS coming and taking over. And in every single one of them, they had either a cultural support team or a female engagement team there with them. And so states are seeing that women are necessary. And to do these roles, though, often include being involved in close combat. They include having to engage in small arms. And they include having to be a cohesive team with the entire unit that's there. So as a result, opening up these positions to women is going to train women from day one to do the job, rather than just sort of slap them on there with a month of training, and also create cohesive teams that are going to do the job better from day one, since they're being trained together. The second functional role is peacekeeping. More and more governments are taking on peacekeeping as one of their primary functions and their primary objectives. And you see this a lot with the Scandinavian countries, if we're talking about Western democracies. And you see this within the African countries and India, Australia. And there's a lot of evidence that women are very, very effective peacekeepers for a myriad of reasons, whether it's being role models or just the cultural sensitivity or a lot of the checking hypermasculinity. But again, peacekeeping frequently involves having to be violent. Peacekeeping isn't all planting flowers and hugging kids. There are violent engagements that need to be made to ensure peace is kept. So again, realizing we need to train women from day one to do this job so they can do it effectively. So we're setting women up for success. So the reason why on the tactical necessity side, and then finally, technology again as it advances is removing some of these burdens that kind of lessen a lot of the arguments as to why women shouldn't be there when it comes to some of the physical arguments as why women shouldn't be there. Technology is really making it easier for people in general to fight wars. Wars are also being fought more than just hand-to-hand combat, but actual tactical savvy and a lot more creative decision making is required to be successful on today's battlefield. But so as states are seeing women are a tactical necessity, they're also realizing it is therefore important to train them as one from day one. So the next are the cultural and the societal impacts as to why states are now bringing women into the force. Sustaining an all-volunteer force is really one of them. Most Western states have moved to an all-volunteer military. There's not conscription, so rather than it being a class, the military is a choice, is a profession you can choose, and to keep it that way, you need to draw from a bigger and bigger talent pool. So that's one just of the practical side to sort of get that out of the way. But more than that, really norms about what equality actually means. I talked about before how there is this idea that your soldiers are fighting for your country, you get certain citizenship rights, you get sort of special citizenship privileges. A lot of democracies now are giving those privileges to everybody, that everybody has equal access to Social Security, to healthcare, to educational benefits, to everything. So from that comes equal responsibility. And so bringing women in isn't as much about saying, oh, we're bringing women, giving them something special. It's we're leveling the playing field. That if all citizens get the same rights, all of them have the same responsibilities if they so choose to meet them. It also comes from the argument of the military as a career. As an all-volunteer force, the military is a career path now for people. The way that promotions are typically handled in the military is they come from the combat arms type leadership, and the argument being made that women should have equal access. If women have equal access in the rest of the country's career fields, they should have equal access in this one. And it doesn't necessarily mean equal outcome or that there should be an X amount of women in there, but they need at least to have the option and the opportunity. And this goes back to the idea of the military really reflecting the values of the society in which it protects. That citizens, civilian citizens, are much more comfortable with a military that allows for this equal opportunity than for a military that doesn't. So with all this, there are some definite challenges that exist to military integration that don't exist to rebel integration. So rebel groups, being non-governmental, can basically do whatever they want, and they can use it as saying that, well, we're doing it to defy the government, and they'll get a lot more buy-in. Militaries are a little more difficult to just say, oh, we're going to do whatever we want. So the first stuff is you always have the practical arguments, the physicality, which still comes up as an argument. And these are things that I am more than happy to address in the Q&A rather than go into like huge detail about all of them. But you still have the physical arguments that women just can't do the job, or that you're going to make it weaker, you're going to be less effective with it. And then it goes into the equipment sides of it. We're going to have to make all new stuff for women, where things fit women. These are all the practical arguments that you get. But more than that, really hinges on these cultural arguments of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable for women to do. We can be okay with a woman being in a support role, doing her job that way, but the reality is that support roles are just as susceptible to combat action as infantry is today. But it's that sort of feel-good idea. And then the final one, and one that will open a huge Pandora's box, is the idea of the created sexual tension that exists. That men and women just shouldn't be in these sort of jobs together because nothing good will ever come of it. And you can go Google me and read all of my thoughts about that to save time, or I'm happy to answer them later. And so to conclude, just wanted to bring up some sort of the way my own research is heading with this, and then also some questions that, for those of you who are going to be going out to the policy world soon, to really keep in the back of your mind when we start talking about these discussions, and then also just for the informed citizen who gets kind of bombarded with this in the media every day right now because it seems to be kind of a popular topic, some ways to sort of critically address this. First is there something unique about the military tension, the conduct of political violence? So is it that we're uncomfortable with women in the military and that institution and what that institution really represents in society, or are we uncomfortable with women being violent? And I think if you look at the Kurds, for example, and the way that the Western media glorifies the women in the PKK, and yet vilifies women who are trying to get into infantry officer corps here, you think about what do we really have a problem with women doing? Where do women really, where does that tension lie? Is it institutional, or is it the actual act of violence? The next is the top-down push to include women stronger than the bottom-up, or is it vice versa? Is it women who are clamoring for these jobs that are making the change, or is it the institution saying, we need women to make these change, and are kind of dragging women in reluctantly? And this is, I think, the hardest question to actually ask, because people are kind of afraid to challenge either side, but it's one that's very, very important. Whether is this an individual agency? Is this a woman saying, like, no, I want this opportunity, or is it the state saying, we need women to do this? And depending on the answer, how do we go about making the policies? Because if it is a state saying, we need women who are willing to do this, how much power should the state have to say, hey, no, we actually need you, you need to come do this? Versus how much power should an individual citizen have to say, it's my right to serve my country, you're not letting me do this. So those raise some very interesting questions of tension. And then when we think about the international system more broadly, what changes do you foresee either accelerating this, that women are going to become more and more engaged, or dampening it? Is there anything that could really change society and change these norms and say, well, no, maybe this isn't where women belong? And so I will conclude there. Thank you very much for listening to me. And